everybody. This is Dr. John Morris, and today I want to talk about religious groups or denominations within Judaism in the first century. Now, I think the first thing we have to do is get over the fact that there is no one specific kind of Judaism. It's a little bit like today, if I were to ask you to describe Christianity, you would say, well, what kind of Christianity? We've got Catholicism that's very different from Protestantism, and within the Protestant denomination, the Methodists are very different than the Baptist. So there is no one particular kind of Christianity today. Now, that doesn't mean the Catholics are wrong or the Methodists are wrong or even the Baptists are wrong, but there are a lot of different denominations under the heading of Christianity. And it was exactly the same way in the first century. You had a number of religious groups, perhaps hundreds of Jewish denominations, just like you have today. So I want to spend a little bit of time going over some of them and maybe introducing you to one or two that you never thought about before. Now, the first group are the Sadducees. These are the ones that are in religious power at the time of Jesus because they have allied themselves with the Romans. In fact, in many cases, they've in essence sold out to the Romans. They have become the Romans' henchmen. They enforce the Roman tax policy, and they become Roman in many of their social ways. So they are typically where the high priest would come from, the temple leadership would come from in the time of Jesus, and they are not particularly liked by the people. One, because they are kind of sold out to the Romans, and two, because they're very, very corrupt, and that they've started fighting for the priest jobs or high priest jobs. And in fact, they will kill and maim and kidnap and steal just to get to be high priest, because that is such a powerful position, because the Romans are supporting it. So the Sadducees have the power. Theologically, they're more conservative. They only believe in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. So if it's not in the Torah, resurrection for instance, they don't believe in it. So I guess socially they're kind of liberal, but religiously they're kind of conservative, at least as far as the books of the Bible they believe. Now, religiously they're also very accommodating to the Romans. So it's kind of a mismatch. And again, very similar to what we see in some Christian denominations today. Now, the Sadducees got their start in that intertestamental period, about 170 BC, where we see most of the religious groups in the first century getting their start. But they are Torah believers, they are Roman accommodators, and they are in power and control the temple and the priesthood at the time of Jesus. The second big group are the Pharisees. Now, they have their origin about the same time as the Sadducees, 150 to 200 BC, that intertestamental period. Religiously, they are more liberal. They feel like that their beliefs need to adapt and change as time goes on. So they are willing to accept all of what we would call the Old Testament as an authoritative doctrine. So therefore, they believe in resurrection, for instance. Now, on the other hand, rather than accommodating the Romans, they've decided to pull back, and they've decided that their pathway to heaven sort of is to strictly obey all of the Old Testament laws that they possibly can, more than 600 of them. So they really are sincerely focused on pleasing God based on their lifestyle of following these laws. Now, they are more accepted by the people. Their power base is out in the countryside and in the synagogues. Now, the people don't necessarily like their self-righteousness, but they appreciate the seriousness with which they approach religion. So the Pharisees are the ones that might be the scribes or whatever in the local villages, that if you needed to write a letter, you would go to a Pharisee. You might say, well, he's kind of hard to get along with, but when you need somebody honest, at least you can trust the Pharisee. They are not accommodating from the Romans. They're pulling back from the Romans. And this is the group that Jesus reached out to very, very much. Sometimes we think that the Pharisees were just totally wrong. But if you think about it, the Pharisees' belief were very similar to Jesus' belief, resurrection and angels and things like that. So all the Pharisees needed to do is get over this idea that the law was everything, and then their beliefs pretty much lined up with what we would call modern Christianity today. And if you think about it, Jesus chose one Pharisee, Paul, to spread the word to the Gentiles. So the Pharisees were very close, but they were still not there. Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other's guts. If one of them said it was Monday, the other group would probably say, no, I think it's Tuesday. And they were often violent about this conflict. If you look back at, from 200 BC or so to the time of Jesus, during times of different power, whoever was in power, Pharisees or the Sadducees, they would do their best to kill the other people. In fact, even crucify them. So we have records, historical records of hundreds of the opposing party being crucified. So these guys do not get along together well. You see this in Acts when Paul calls on his brother Pharisees to support him, and all of a sudden the fact of whether Paul is guilty or not goes out the window because the Pharisees are arguing with the Sadducees. Third group, and this might be a larger group, but we don't necessarily know a lot more about them, are the Essenes. About the same time period of their origin, that intertestamental time period. But these guys have looked at Jerusalem, they've looked at the corrupt priesthood and said, you know what? God is going to destroy Jerusalem just like he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Essenes take their manuscripts, their scrolls, all their worship practices, and they leave Jerusalem. They go out and they live by the Dead Sea in the Qumran community because they think that God is going to destroy Jerusalem, and then once God has destroyed Jerusalem, then they will be the high priest and rule the world and all that good stuff. So they are very, very religious. They're very, very serious about their practices, so serious that they've isolated themselves from society. They are great scholars and great preservers of the manuscripts, and that's why we have very accurate manuscripts of the Old Testament today, is because, again, in this time of Jesus, 150 BC to about 70 AD, they took their manuscripts, they went to the desert, and they put these leather manuscripts in clay jars and hid them in caves when the Romans came. Their thought was, when the Romans left, we'll come back, we'll get our manuscripts, and everything will be like it always was. Of course, the Romans killed them all, as the Romans were wont to do, and these leather manuscripts and these clay jars stayed hidden until about the late 1940s, 1950s. So we can go back, thanks to the Essenes and the Qumran community, and look at the actual manuscripts from about the time of Jesus. Fourth religious group you need to know about are the Zealots. Now these were the guys that centered around the Sea of Galilee, and their philosophy kind of was kill everybody, let God sort them out. So these were the ones that would ambush Romans and stir up trouble. The Romans would come in and kill some Zealots, so then more Zealots would come in and kill the Romans, and it just kind of went back and forth, and they were more violent, they caused more problems, but this was early in Jesus' time sort of a background sort of problem. Now, along about 60 AD and 70 AD, they actually instigate a revolution against Rome, and Rome comes in and kills them all, as is their wont. The last group that I want to talk about are followers of the way. Now, you've probably heard of these people, but you might not have heard them called followers of the way. These are Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ, as the Son of God. Early Christians were not called Christians. They were Jewish, first of all, and they were called followers of the way. And as more Gentiles came in, they were called followers of the way. If you look at what Paul calls himself, he is a follower of the way. Now, I think this is important because we tend to think of Christianity as separate from Judaism, but Christianity in its roots is Judaism. It's Judaism fulfilled. So these people were called followers of the way, who were believers in Christ, who were disciples of Christ. Now, as the first century goes forward, we get in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Christianity becomes into being as a name. Christians are first called Christians in Antioch, and then towards the end of the first century, we see Christianity definitely branching off from Judaism. But Christianity in its roots is a denomination of Judaism. So Paul considered himself a Jew. He just considered himself a follower of the way, like he would consider himself a Pharisee or something like that. So I think we need to remember when we're reading the Gospels and the New Testament, is we're reading it from a very, very Jewish background, because that's where we all got our start. So I hope that kind of helps you identify the players. You've got the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, and followers of the way, and many, many more groups in the first century, but those are the major ones. So, until next time, bye-bye.